Hi, Dr. Sedlak.
Morning.
Uh, Good morning to you. How are you, Professor?
I'm very well. I'm okay. I'm fighting a bit of a cold I caught over the weekend. So,
I also thank you very much for honoring our meeting, even you having this flu, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.
okay, good. And so you received a copy of the book from
Yes, yes,
the
I received it. Actually, this is Dr. Sedlak's newly published book. Thank you very much for sharing it with me. Yeah, we
That's
need to also read this one too. So for the book fans, it's a beautiful book. Your Waters 40 is also like I'm very amazed to read that. Really, very well dense book, informing very well. Thank you.
um I had looked at the questions you sent in advance and I thought it would be a little bit boring just to work through questions one at a time, but they gave me an idea about the kinds of things people are interested in. And so I prepared a few remarks to start a discussion, and then maybe we could take it from there. Would that be okay?
Sounds wonderful. Thank you. Please, yeah, go ahead.
So I wanted to share with you um, three quotes. I think one of them may show up in the book a little bit, but they're quotes that I think help address some of the things that I've been thinking about and that were spurred in my mind by your questions. And some of these are also behind my decision to write the second book, Water for All. So maybe I'll back up for a minute and say that Water 4.0 was not a book I thought I would end up writing. I had been involved in discussions with members of the public and with elected officials about potable water recycling projects, like the project in Orange County that's described in the book. And I was always surprised at how much members of the public were interested in learning more. I mean, you have some people who all they care about is what their groceries costs and what time they're picking up their kids from school and what the latest TikTok video is. You'll never reach them. But I mean among people who would show up at a public meeting or people who worked in water fields and in government fields, there was a great interest in knowing more about water. And as I gave more and more of these talks, I realized that unless you're willing to go and get a degree in engineering or water science or law, it's very hard to learn these things. And so, part of my thought here was that people who are not water professionals might be able to get a glimpse into our world by reading this book. And if you read the preface of the book, I talk about how I had to give a talk in front of a very large audience at a small college in Minnesota where everyone else was giving really exciting talks about scuba diving and dramatic things that they had done with water. And here I was talking about the humble water and sewage treatment plants, and I really didn't know how to reach people. So I decided to tell this story about history. So I wrote this book, Water 4.0, and then what happened to me is I got many more opportunities to meet and talk to groups of people who were not environmental engineers, and especially got to travel more around the world. And in fact, I think one of the things that motivated this book is a visit to Turkey that I made, where I gave a talk at a water convention. And as I would talk to the professionals and the students and the people organizing the conference, I realized that my world of water is so much different than other people's world of water. And that was true when I would go to China or India or Southeast Asia or Singapore or Australia or Western Europe. Every place has a different water story. And especially low and middle income countries can't afford the kinds of high technology solutions that might be common in the Western United States. But that's also true for other parts of the United States. I travel to other cities and other states within the US, and they say, well, we could never afford such an expensive water system. So the more recent book that I wrote tries to address some of these issues, but I'll try to share with you these three quotes that I think address some of the questions you had. One set of questions kind of asked about at what point does it make sense to start adopting expensive water technologies like seawater desalination and advanced treatment for potable water reuse. And I think that you really don't want to do this until you've done all of the less expensive, well-proven things that people have done in the past. And so my quote here comes from, at least it's been attributed to the CEO of Duke Energy Company. This is a power company in the southeast of the United States. And I have never been able to find the original quote, but it goes something like this. The most environmentally sound, inexpensive, and reliable power plant that I ever built is the one that I never built. And the idea behind this quote is that conservation is an extremely powerful tool for saving water. And so when we look around the world, we see that places where it makes sense to invest in these high-tech water solutions are usually places where the per capita water use is quite low. And that's because those places have implemented the typical and important water saving measures like low flow plumbing fixtures. They've gotten leaks out of the water system. They've pushed appliance standards and all of these other things. And so, if you look around the wealthiest OECD countries, you see like Australia and Belgium and the Netherlands and Sweden and even Germany and Spain and Italy, somewhere around 100 liters per person per day for water use. And that's kind of where it bottoms out in terms of water use. And to go much below that is still quite difficult because of, the things that people want to do with water when they're wealthy that can't really be substituted. Now, when we travel in the United States, we see that there are many cities where the per capita water use is about 4 times that. So Los Angeles and New York, 400 liters per person per day. And so if people in New York and Los Angeles use the same amount of water as people in Italy and Spain and Holland, then their problems would be solved. They wouldn't have to build these expensive power plants. And in some cases, it is a question of needing to do the hard work to get people to take on water conservation. But in other cases, it's either that there's not water scarcity. So in the case of New York City, there's plenty of water. So there was never reason to push water conservation. And in Los Angeles and many of the cities in the Western United States, at least half of the water use happens outdoors. The way that American cities are built, they tend to be single family dwellings. They tend to have space around them. They have a yard. And when you have a yard, if you don't water it at all the plants die. It becomes very hot and unpleasant. And so if you have a city and people are already using water to keep trees and shrubs alive in a garden, it's going to be very hard to convince them to give that up. So we can reduce the amount of water and we can become more efficient, but it's very hard to, and maybe not even a good idea when you think about the urban heat island effect and things like this. When we go away from wealthiest countries to low and middle income countries, we run into another issue, and this is described in the new book, and that's that water utilities rely upon selling water to generate revenue. And so even though it might be obvious how a water utility could reduce its water use, they may have a reason to not do this because if people reduce their water use, the utility collects less money. And so you have to be able to convince the public that they're going to use less water and the water they use is going to be more expensive. And that's what they need to do to make the system better. And that politically is a very difficult thing to do. In many low and middle income countries, the utilities don't collect enough water to pay for the operation of the water treatment plants. So it comes from another government source of revenue, like tax money or something like this. And so there are a lot of disincentives where conservation doesn't really happen because of institutional reasons. And so, I think that for me, the big lesson I learned when I looked around the world and I asked the question, why isn't everyone building desal plants? Why isn't everyone building reverse osmosis membrane systems? I think so much of the real hard work we have to do is at the institutional level. And it involves getting people to understand what water costs and how treatment plants operate. My second quote comes from a science fiction writer named William Gibson. And William Gibson is, at least I've never exactly found the exact quote either, but people always quote him. And the quote is, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." And this idea that what is out there in the future, what is my water system going to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? The answer is probably out there already. I'm not just talking about something that's been invented in a laboratory. There are places around the world which the social scientists refer to as protected spaces. These are small communities uh, where people are facing a challenge that's deeper than the challenges in other places. And because they're a little bit isolated, they take risks on new ideas and they pioneer new ways of doing things. And so in Water 4.0, I tried to talk about like some of the innovations that happened in Rome, or the water treatment, drinking water treatment that happened in the US and Western Europe when people were facing crises of a lack of water supply or crises of waterborne disease. And so there are a lot of things that are out there already that may be our future. And the real question is, does that future fit in my place? And so I think it's very important to look around the world and not only in one place or the place that has the most information available, but to really travel and try to understand what people are doing, and then to figure out if that approach can be adapted to your way of doing things. And I think for water, that's another thing that makes it much more difficult. So if someone writes a computer program or an app, it's easy enough to translate it into Turkish, for example, and make the Turkish equivalent app, or to use the program to solve a slightly different problem. It's probably even easier with respect to energy. So, like, if you think about solar panels, they were first things that were put up in the wealthiest countries, maybe by the wealthiest people in those countries, because they wanted to show everyone that they had the coolest toys. But over time, the prices dropped and people in other countries repurposed those solar panels for new things. And so now, if you travel to a rural village in sub-Saharan Africa, you'll see people using solar panels and cell phones too, for reasons that the original inventors never thought were possible. Now, water's a little bit different because it does have this public health side of it where people can become sick, and it has cultural significance that's different than energy. But I think this question of the future being here and not being evenly distributed is something to think about. So when you think about solving Istanbul's water problems, maybe it's desalination of water, or maybe it's water recycling, but it could be something completely different also. And I wanted to share one of these things with you that's in the new book that I think doesn't get enough attention. And that's this idea of doing water recycling at the building scale, something that's sometimes called on-site reuse. So it's this idea, and there are these pockets around the world where this is already an accepted technology. For example, if you go to Tokyo, many buildings in the Shinjuku neighborhood of Tokyo have their own water recycling systems within the building. And they reuse water for things like toilet flushing and hand washing and landscape irrigation. So this idea of recycling water at the building scale, right now, the two things that I find most interesting are either the high technology approach that's being used in places like San Francisco or New York, where when a new building is built, you put in the basement a small biological wastewater treatment system like a membrane bioreactor, and then you can reuse the water, you can disinfect the water from the membrane bioreactor and reuse that water in the building to offset about half of the building's water demand. And so we have buildings that have been operating for several decades in the United States where the per capita water use is about half of a normal building because they're recycling the water within the building. And this idea is taking off a little bit and becoming popular because architects can sell this to the people who buy fancy buildings because they'll say, oh, it's a, an ecologically friendly building. The problem with this is that in many cities in the wealthier parts of the world, the population growth has slowed down. And so, if the buildings are being renovated or knocked down and replaced after 50 or 100 years, then it's going to take many, many years for this to really have an impact on cities. But this is certainly a policy that people are following in San Francisco, which is the nearest big city to where I live. But the second one that I think is also quite interesting is what's happening in Bangalore in India. So Bangalore has it's the Silicon Valley of India, so it's growing very quickly. It's very economically prosperous, but they don't have a very reliable water supply. So rather than investing in imported water and all the other things that cities typically do, Bangalore is requiring new buildings to put in on-site water recycling systems. And especially the wealthier people in Bangalore are actually starting to put in modern systems with things like membrane bioreactors, and they're reusing that water for potable purposes. Because as you know, in most parts of the world, people don't drink the water out of the tap. They might boil the water and use it to make tea. They certainly will take a shower in this water, but they're not drinking it without some sort of additional treatment. And so in Bangalore, it's actually starting to be seen as a benefit or a feature of a building that might make a person want to live there. Because during the times of the year when there's no water being delivered by the municipal water system, these homes have a water source. And then my third quote is a quote that people attribute to Dr. Martin Luther King. It's actually not true. It's something that is quite a bit older than that. It's attributable to someone who was a pastor, an abolitionist in the U.S. during the time of the Civil War. But I like this quote a great deal, and you probably heard it. The quote is, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I think that that quote has been seen in a political sense by many people when they see things happening in the world that they're uncomfortable with and they believe are injustices. But in my case, it applies as much to this idea of climate change and the lack of action that people are taking in response to climate change. I see increasingly the water crises that are the most concerning in the world are not crises of poor management or pollution or population growth. They're increasingly going to be due to climate change. As the wet places in the world become wetter and we see more frequent severe storms and flooding, and the dry places in the world become drier as the atmosphere warms and the atmosphere holds more water. And the last few years, it's really felt like we've taken a step backwards. In the US, in the last 6 months, we've moved away from having a strong stance about responding to the threats of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And we've seen decreases in funding for many of the things that we're going to need to get through droughts. But I also realize that this is the best climate that any of us will ever live in from here on in. It's only going to get drier in the drier places and hotter, and it's only going to get wetter with larger storms in the wetter places. And so one of the things that drives this arc of the moral universe in terms of a need to respond to climate change is that the challenges we're going to face in providing safe, affordable, and abundant water are increasingly going to have to be considered within the framework of climate change. And so the new book is largely driven by this concern that, with population growth and global economic development, we were already struggling to keep up with our ability to grow enough food and provide enough water for people. With climate change, it will even become tougher. So those are the remarks I prepared, and they were kind of inspired by your questions, but I'd be happy to answer any other questions or expand on any of these thoughts or talk about anything else that interests the group in the book or about water in general.
Thank you, Dr. Sedlak. So, anyone wants to ask questions, please free to ask. Actually, your perspective made a lot of change in my mind. My look to water management framed differently now. Like you're saying, importing water from far away to bring it in, recycling, reusing is more convenient in terms of economical feasibility. But the thing is, for land areas like you did in Atlanta, in some of your areas, yeah, you have the space to do it. But big cities like Istanbul, New York, London, very dense areas. So I'm also curious, what is the most optimum way to how to recycle the water? Because we don't really have area to do anything here.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
trying to upgrading our wastewater treatment plants, but we don't have space for that. So
Yeah. Well, so these nature-based systems that I love and I study in some of my research, I agree with you. In a very densely populated city, um, they may not have a place where you could build a giant treatment wetland or something like that. But I do see the European and Middle Eastern experience of having very densely populated cities is challenging. But I also see there's lots of parts of the world where the density of cities is quite a bit lower. So I've seen constructed wetlands not only in Southern California, but in the area of Dallas, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia, and those are big cities. So in a place like the US or Australia, where there is a lot of land around cities, that's fine. But in a big city with a high population density like Istanbul, really it has to be either mechanical treatment systems or this kind of nature-based treatment system has to happen many kilometers outside of the city where, and so Istanbul, you also have a discharge point of the wastewater treatment plants into a water body, so that doesn't make sense. But for example, Mexico City, which is a very densely populated city, which until recently didn't treat any of its sewage, they treat the wastewater about 100 kilometers downriver of the city. And they use a mechanical treatment system and then they apply that water to agriculture. But they could have used a nature-based system, for example, for Mexico City, because the location of the actual treatment plant, because it was only built about 10 years ago, was very far away from the city because they couldn't even acquire land for a conventional wastewater treatment plant. The other thing I would say about nature-based systems, maybe the real application in a densely populated, hot, dry city is for urban greening. And so I've been working with some engineers who work on these building scale water treatment systems. And the idea of creating green space around buildings, like in Barcelona, there's this idea of eco blocks where people think about rethinking the urban landscape to bring in more trees and shrubs and plants because it can help cool the hot city and reuse some of the water. These building scale water treatment systems seem very well suited for urban greening because there's not, you don't want to start increasing the water demand within a city, but if you want to try to grow more trees and create gardens that make the city more livable, there may be a connection here with these nature-based systems.
yeah, thank you. Actually, Dr. Karpuzcu, I think you were doing some sort of wetland studies, weren't you? In Istanbul.
Yes, yes.
So how was the studies with that? I'm just curious.
It's actually challenging because of the administrative issues. At the planning stage, everything is fine, but when the time comes for the implementation, the administration says that, similarly, we don't have space for it. It's not a proven technology. We need to see more data because it's not widespread in our country, unfortunately. It's more commonly applied in Europe. I was actually in a panel 2 years ago. I did a presentation about these nature-based solutions, and I kind of advocated that it's also possible to integrate these systems in dense cities like Istanbul, by means of these building scale treatment plants. And I was advocating these compact systems more used in Europe, these subsurface flow wetlands, like vertical flow. Even the French. In France, they modified it further to have French type wetlands where they have no or little, very little sludge accumulation. So and it's very well known. They have a lot of data for it. Why don't you try these first in rural, other smaller cities before Istanbul? It's more suitable for them. But the problem is that we actually have the problem here in the big cities, not like in the small cities. But they want to see some real proven applications before they want to take the risk, because they see it as a risk, and they are mostly concerned about, there is also a political part of it, because they want to provide safe water to the citizens and also clean the water, the wastewater, in a safe manner, and that's what matters most to them. And they don't think like us, like we need to do innovative stuff, and they don't necessarily plan for like climate change for 20 years ahead or something. They just want to save the day. So that's why I have been struggling to advocate these nature-based solutions in our country. But I saw in the conferences I participate, I see that in Europe they are all going to advanced technologies.
I'll give you another jumping off point beside the US and Europe, and that would be China and the Sponge City movement. So I don't know if you probably heard about Sponge City.
I heard. Yeah.
And I was a little bit cautious about Sponge City because the information I was able to learn about it sounded like too good to be true, and it wasn't really translated well into English. But last year, I met the landscape architect, Kangjian Yu, who was the person behind a lot of Sponge City. And I really came around to understanding it as something that made a lot of sense in the Chinese context. So in the context of Chinese cities and urban flooding, they had these large floodplains in and around their cities that they could use to store water when high flows came, and they made them into urban parks. And if you have a chance to find some of these, they usually are like in architectural magazines or books about architecture. The designs, they create new spaces for the public within the city that are green and restful and cool, and they're designed for flooding. So if like you build this park and a flood comes through, it doesn't damage it because all of the viewing platforms and things are raised above the water level. And I found that was something that is much easier for an elected official or someone at a water agency to get behind, because the public really likes them. They're very beautiful. But that's stormwater, not wastewater.
Yeah, and that requires to work together with the landscape architects to have an appealing design for.
Yeah, absolutely.
May I have a question about stormwater?
Yes.
Because I think I listened to a TED talk of yours, and I heard there you were mentioning water aquifers to make use of the stormwaters. Well, in Istanbul and in northern of Turkey, we have very often floods. Do you think that water can also be collected in aquifers? And another question will be, in the middle of Turkey, there are some lowlands where poners emerged. Actually, they were not intended to be there, but are they also usable to be water aquifers? Or can they be transformed into such things? I just wonder.
Well, I'll start with the first question. In the new book, I really wanted to dig into that question a little bit. I was familiar with ways in which stormwater is captured and used in the US, but it's still early days. And the place where I found a lot of inspiration was again in India, because there's a long history of this monsoon culture where, you get monsoon rains and then not much water for the rest of the year. And so farmers and cities have developed some very sophisticated approaches for capturing and storing water. You may have seen photographs of these step wells that are used in India to store water, but these were, this is kind of an ancient technology of capturing monsoon rains, and some of it is taken out of the step well, but some of it is also used for groundwater recharge. And so between that and some of the wadis in places like Yemen, where ancient civilizations used to intentionally route water across a floodplain to recharge aquifers, this this is an old knowledge that that I think in places in the world where the geology was cooperative, but even in places where it wasn't cooperative, people found creative ways to do it. So I have a lot of hope for this idea of managed aquifer recharge as a way to provide us with a new water supply that's less damaging to the environment. Here in the US, people have been experimenting with something called flood managed aquifer recharge, which means that farmers are intentionally flooding their fields during the winter time. So we have a Mediterranean climate where we get more of our precipitation in the winter. And so farmers are intentionally flooding their fields during winter and letting the water percolate into the ground. And then they use that as the irrigation water during the summertime. And they're learning kind of which plants, so the worry that farmers have always had is that if the soil is still saturated in the springtime, when the plants come out of dormancy and start growing, then they'll suffocate, they'll die. And so the farmers are learning which kinds of plants can tolerate this and which kinds of geology. But I think it's something that I think will help in some places. So I think it's not an obvious or absolute solution, but it's one where I think we need more research and we need to use more of the tools of geology and geotechnical engineering to make it work better. But I have a great belief in it, and I write about it in the newer book. And your second question was about flooding in the central part of Turkey that's creating marshes, wetlands?
Well, actually, drought causes ponors to occur in lowlands. I
Ah,
mean, yeah, big holes in the ground
yeah.
that never used to be there, but then the lowlands can't be
Oh,
used anymore, or you can't even drive around.
wow.
Such things started to emerge.
Oh, goodness. I had no
And I
idea.
was, yeah, unfortunately. So maybe I was thinking, could they be transformed into aquifers? But
Ah,
since there's drought, maybe
yeah.
we won't have enough water.
Well, I am, in the Western United States, we've stopped talking about drought and we have this term aridification. And aridification means that it's not, a drought is something that lasts a few years and goes away. But when you look at like what's happened in Iran in the last decades, that is seems like a new climate. And this is exactly what the meteorologists predicted with climate change. That is that the Hadley cells, these circulation cells that take air from the equator up to the atmosphere and then come down at like 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude, they've always predicted that the Hadley cells are going to expand. And so like Southern Europe is going to end up with the climate of Morocco, and the southern part of the United States is going to end up with the climate of the Mexico Sonora Desert, and the great deserts in Australia are going to expand. We're seeing that happening. And so as the temperature gets warmer, the air holds more water, evapotranspiration rates increase, and the growing season for trees and plants is longer and they consume more water. And so I think it's time to start thinking about describing some of this as aridification, which is a long-term process of drying up of areas that used to be quite suitable for agriculture, but we're going to have to think about different ways of farming if it's hotter and drier.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we're seeing the effects in our country, unfortunately. We see a lot of droughts in some of our areas, and also a change in the regime of the like what used to be grown in the soil. So we're seeing the effects of climate change. Absolutely. I was in one of our lake last year in Istanbul, and it was really dry, 95%, I mean. And I was so scared to see that. And it's happening a lot of places in Turkey. Professor, I like the way you describe wastewater, how the Roman Empire said the money doesn't stink. That understanding the perception of waste for different cultures. So for us, for the Turks, it's different, and it's for like the Asian and the Westerns and so on and so on. And then I like the discussions you mentioned there in the 18th century, how some of these known intellectual people were talking about how we shall not waste the wastewater.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was just thinking also as a Muslim in our context, we're not allowed to waste in our religion. So we were just discussing how, so like in Istanbul, wastewater we're producing every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was coming to my mind, and I studied in that water. It's a very nutritious water. I studied Daphne,
Yeah.
and they were growing so well. And then I also worked in the wastewater treatment plant. I saw like the birds were bringing the seeds in the wastewater treatment plant, how the pumpkin was getting huge, but no one wanted to eat it because it was grown in the wastewater treatment plant. So the Turks are afraid that something bad will come out of it because it's grown with the wastewater. So yeah, the perception is very interesting. And then it popped in my mind, as I said, for the Muslim context, how would you think about wastewater? This is what I'm thinking since I read your book. Thank you. You made me think of that. And yeah, so it's an issue. Like, are we wasting all these waters? But we were talking with our friends, Mr. Urn. So he's one of the experts in Istanbul. Dicle is also one of the expert in the water section. So we're just talking like, how can we reuse the water? But the state of Istanbul, the pumping, the transportation expenses and so on. So like, how to use it? So yeah, we also need to think about again what the wastewater is and how we shall use that water. And if Zeynep also, I wanted to ask Zeynep if you have any also perspective on the reuse of wastewater and so on. So yeah.
Well, actually, I'm an applied mathematics engineer. I haven't been studying anything about water until I read your book. I was really impressed. I really appreciate having joined this book club and having seen you here. But as a Muslim, because I'm studying on the Quran, I always see the importance of water because as Ijlan mentioned, we are not supposed to waste, but water is where everything has begun, because according to the Quran, God has created every living thing out of water. And God brings down from the sky the water, and it's in his control. And it is a purifier for us. So it's very valuable. It's like kind of sacred source. And when Prophet Muhammad was alive, he has forbidden water wastage. So, I mean, it is already still forbidden for everyone. But I heard a word of his when, we have to have ablution before our daily ritual prayers. And that is therefore water is very important for us. And when he saw someone having ablution on the bank of a river, and he said, "What is this waste of water?" And even when having ablution, and even in here, he said, "Yes, even at the bank of a flowing river, you are not supposed to waste water." So when I read your book, and then when I thought about this, I was really impressed, because anything, and I'm also worried about what we do in our mosques and homes. We do not use the ablution water. We do not reuse it. But during the history of Islam, I see that after the pass away of Prophet Muhammad, Muslim scholars ever discussed about the reuse of water.
I mean, I can share my experience there because this has come up a few times. When Orange County was planning their water recycling project, they sent out the staff of the utility to meet with various groups, including religious leaders. And so they sent the managers out to the imam of the local mosque to have a discussion about this recycled water. And my understanding of it was that the concern is that he was just so happy that the water utility was paying attention to Islamic values in their planning process, that he brought the community on board and said it was fine. But I've spent time on websites like searching, and I don't read Arabic, so I'm a little bit of a disadvantage, but it seems to come down to this idea that water is used to prepare the body for burial, and that water from where bodies are being prepared for burial goes into the sewer, and that kind of adds to this unacceptable nature of the sewage water. And I've seen this, in many cultures now. There's kind of like, this isn't specific to a religion, but it's a cultural belief that comes from a long experience with disease. And so, if I could think about where it comes from just a long-term cultural viewpoint, it's that, of course, human waste can get people sick. And of course, people have to learn not to drink their water from a place that's contaminated with human waste, because otherwise they'd become quite sick. And there's this also recognition that as water flows through a river or a wetland or even a lake, it becomes purified. And so there is kind of a cultural belief in most societies that nature can treat and restore the safety of water. And that's comes from thousands of years of experience. And so here, as engineers, we have this technology that we know can also do the same thing, but in a little plastic tube or with shining a light on the water. And that violates our cultural expectations because there's not the same type of spiritual purification. So in the new book, I talked about how in New Zealand, where the Maori people have a strong preference against putting sewage back into rivers, that they build treatment wetlands to purify the water before it goes back into nature. So I think there's a lot of need to pay attention to not only religious edicts, but also cultural expectations about water when we work with the public. And maybe there are things that we don't understand that happen during this kind of natural purification. That's why, at least for the first water recycling projects, having a period when the water passes through the soil or passes through a wetland or a river made it more culturally acceptable to people.
Wow, thank you. Very interesting talk. Thank you to both. And Mr. Aaron, so we were curious your thoughts about wastewater reuse and also the effects of climate change on our wastewater treatment plants and system in Istanbul.
Thank you, Ijlal. I am very pleased to be here with your existence, and I am very pleased to meet Mr. David. We learned too much from his comments made now and just now, and also we have and learned many things. And the books overlooks the history of water, water systems from the ancient times to the modern times, and the solutions they touch. And I am very impressed with the book. First, I have to tell this. And regarding the treated wastewater reuse of the Istanbul, the central government after COVID pandemic occurrence. It published a target for the metropolitan municipalities. The target was the 5 to 10% of the treated wastewater should be recycled, and therefore the municipalities like Istanbul have to install their reused facilities like UV facilities, UF facilities, and so on. So we have to reuse the wastewater that we treated, and we have to give this reused water to industry or agricultural uses. At the moment, we have using the conventional reused technologies like UV and UF and membrane technology. And happily, we are giving this some portion of the 5% of the total wastewater treatment plant to industries like textile or leather industry in the Asian side. And so we are very happy that both municipalities and the central government encourage the industry to use this water. So we are happy being used this water by the industry. The problem is here is to transfer the wastewater to industry. So there has to be some links should be to be installed by the municipalities in extra investment cost. Also the demands of the industry. So we have to find the ways, the needs, the demands, and the location of the treatment plants. We have to make plans in the futures to use the whole capacity of these facilities in a certain level. So this is the story of our reuse was the treated wastewater reuse in Istanbul. So we are doing this. We have to expand our target addressed by the regulations and by the central government. So in order to find the new client, I mean the industry, we have to we have to install the pipes and the pumping systems, and this is also, the extra cost. So we are going to wait at this time.
Thank you very much.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting. I wanted to add that, this is the same direction that we started with in California. The idea was we could reuse the wastewater for, oil refineries and for farms and things like this. And then over time, of course, the story of the US, there's less and less manufacturing as we undergo this deindustrialization. And
Mhm.
so there are not enough factories in the cities anymore, and the distances between the users and the wastewater is so far that you need to build an entirely new distribution network.
Yes,
Purple
yes,
pipes,
yes.
we
This
call
is
them.
this is this is the
And
same problem in Turkey also, in
so
Istanbul as well.
so this is one problem, but then the second problem is that you get locked into this. So for example, now um, we have some oil refineries that are starting to close down. So the goal in California is to stop using fossil fuels for automobiles. And so we have 5 oil refineries, and 2 of them have already closed down. One of those oil refineries has this big water recycling project. And so if that refinery closes down, that use of the recycled water goes away overnight. And so, it's you have to think about, like, since you make this plan for these underground pipes and these assets for 30 or 40 years, you have to ask, are we still going to be making textiles in the city, or is textile manufacturing going to go to Southeast
Yes,
Asia?
yes.
Uh, and
Uh-huh.
and so the best example I can see here in the US is a place called West and Central Basin Water Utility, and they have a water recycling plant that makes 5 different types of recycled water. It makes very clean water for high pressure boilers. It makes a lower quality water for lower temperature cooling towers. It makes one water for landscape irrigation, and it makes one water for groundwater recharge for drinking water. And the idea is that if the demand shifts over time, they can change the way the plant operates and retrofit different parts. So I would encourage you, when people talk about these water recycling projects, to think, maybe we can make different qualities of water, because this high pressure, low mineral water can be very valuable. For example, no one talks about this, but in Singapore, the New Water project, which is their water recycling project, the majority of that water goes for high pressure boilers for the petrochemical industry, and also for making deionized water for chemical manufacturing. And so, that it's not going to drinking water, even though they got the public used to this idea of drinking water. So you should keep in mind this concept of fit for purpose water, and that as long as you're using advanced treatment for recycling, you may be able to make that water that's even more valuable, because it has a lower tendency for scaling, and so someone doesn't have to do additional treatment later.
The industry, more and more industry are demanding for example, in the umbrella wastewater treatment where I am operating at the moment, one of the recycling treatment plant is installed already in operations. The capacity is 20 percentage of the capacity is still under operation, and the 80% is absent. So in order to meet these demands, we have to make installation. But the problem is to keep this demand is sustained in the future or not. So the government authorities and the city planners have to make a concrete plan in the, for example, in the coming 20, 30 years to keep this this water is pumped to their industries, and as a result, the investment doesn't going to waste by these applications.
Yeah.
So another reason, the operating and maintaining these systems are very expensive. So the municipality and the central government is subsidizing these extra costs. For example, in Istanbul, the tariff for industry is $3.2 per meter cube, and for reused wastewater, as we producing, the less than $1. So they are very addicted, very pleased to take this water, but the facilities are absent.
Thank you very much for your very interesting insights. Professor Sedlak, how many more minutes do you have? What's your availability?
If we could wrap it up soon, it would be a good idea. I have to go in and teach.
Sure. So yeah, I just wanted to ask Professor Melek. She's a toxicologist, and Dr. Professor Gülsüm Yılmaz Hocam. So I'm also very curious about their very short comments on their issues, since their work. Gülsüm Hoca is working on wastewater treatment, and also Dicle, she's a water expert, and then her concerns very shortly, but like not more than a minute. So like their thoughts on the issues, if possible, in Istanbul, like what would they think of reuse of recycled wastewater in terms of their thoughts? Yeah.
Hi, Ijlal and Dr. Sedlak. Thank you for this book club. So I just give a short contribution to our discussion. We should keep in your mind that wastewater is not only a source for water recycling. We can also recover some other sources like energy, like biopolymers, like nutrients, like metals, even this cellulosic material we can recover from the wastewater. So please keep in your mind that wastewater is a huge source for all these resources. So, and all these material is so important for our community. So we should think about that. Okay. Thank you for the book club. So maybe you can put some idea on it in your next book. Okay. Thank you for all these conversations. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Melek Hocam or Dicle?
Thank you, Professor Sedlak. Thank you, Ijlal. My field is water treatment process. So my question will be a part of water treatment process. But before this, I want to make a comment. I worked in master plan project in Istanbul for future planning of water and wastewater. And to supply future water of Istanbul, we prefer always fresh surface water. So this is for us, for engineers in master plan project, and also for idea of managers. So even if fresh water imports fresh water costs highly, but it seems us less problem. So for a water treatment operation engineer, I don't prefer any trace compound contamination because of any reuse application, especially landscape irrigation or agricultural irrigation seems to me a risk of a trace compound contamination to the drinking water source. So any drinking water source don't include any trace compound. It is safe to treat, but if includes trace compounds, there are always risks of health problem. So I want to make this comment, and also I have a question. Professor Sedlak is mentioned in his book disinfection byproduct because of chlorine. Chlorine disinfection is altered with ozone disinfection, and we know that ozone decomposes organic matter. And after decomposition of organic matter, microorganisms are easily consume organic matter. And we know that, and I experienced this in water treatment plant I work. After ozone application, we apply pre-ozonation, microorganisms activity increase. So it seems to be interesting how ozone can be a post-disinfection agent.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So let me start with the first issue of kind of the preference that engineers have for surface water. This is something that is over 100 years old, and it originally came from the idea that, if you could get a pristine, clean surface water from the mountains or something like this, you knew it was always going to be safer and maybe even taste better. And so that stood for a long time. But I think today, many of our rivers have not only pesticides and nutrients in them from agriculture, but they might have wastewater from an upstream city. And so I've been to many places where the river water is probably worse quality than the water coming out of the sewage treatment plant, because a modern sewage treatment plant can do a much better job purifying the water than some of the small community treatment plants or the agricultural runoff upstream. So Lucas van Vuren, who was the engineer who was responsible for the water recycling project in Namibia, in Windhoek, once said, "Water should be judged by its quality, not its history." And I think that this is true. We're at a point where we can understand that river water is not absolutely safe and clean, and treated wastewater is not necessarily hazardous. They have to be judged based upon their actual quality, not the question of where they were before they got to us. So I think I understand what you're saying, that if you have an option of clean water from a protected catchment, that's a wonderful thing to have. But you also have to remember that someone may have been relying upon that water from that catchment as a fishing stream, or for their ecosystem, or for their own water supply. Your question about ozone and pre-ozonation and post-ozonation, it's a really good one. In Water 4.0, I wrote a wonderful chapter about chlorine chemistry and ozone chemistry, and my editor gave it back to me and told me it didn't belong in the book, because I went too deep into the chemistry and biology of it and I lost my audience. And so somewhere in my notes somewhere is a wonderful chapter that goes into all of these things. But as they say in the movie industry, it got put on the cutting room floor because it was just went into too many of the details. So without getting into the details with you, I think that you have a point that when we look at ozone for disinfection, we need to realize that it also makes the organic carbon more bioavailable to the bacteria. And so a good engineering design of an ozone disinfection system always is followed by biological activated carbon or biological sand filtration. I think we all understand that. But the larger question of like chlorine versus ozone versus chlorine dioxide versus not using a residual at all, this is like one of the great engineering technical questions, and it's going to depend a lot on not only the quality of the water in the city, but the distance that it has to travel in the pipes, and what else might be present in the water. So I don't think we have time to get deep into this, but I completely agree with you that there's a lot of details, and we can't just say ozone's good and chlorine's bad, or the other way around. It really depends on the context and the rest of the treatment process.
Thank you so much for this great talk, everyone, for attending. And Professor Sedlak, we learned a lot from you. Thank you very much. And so we would also appreciate, we were discussing, Dicle is such a very cool water scientists. So if you still have that copy of the part that you took it out, so if you want
Okay.
in terms
Yeah.
of like, yeah, we like those discussion.
And good luck to all of you. I really enjoyed the discussion. If you have any other questions, feel free to write to me. I'm happy to
Thank you. And I would like to thank Öznur to helping us. We did all this organization together, and hope to see you all in our next book club. And thank you for attending all. You have a beautiful day, Professor Sedlak,
Same to you.
and the rest for you too. So have a wonderful day and good night. Bye.
Care,
Thank
everyone.
you very
Bye now.
much.